Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the queen of crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I am Kemper Donovan, and I apologize for the state of my voice. I am getting over a cold, although maybe it's appropriate for a spooky-themed episode here on All About Agatha. Bwah-ha-ha-ha. That was the Count from Sesame Street, in case you were wondering. Happy Halloween, everyone. Halloween 2025. A scary time in so many different ways. Hope everyone is doing well. Stay safe out there this holiday season. Before we get started discussing the Gipsy, which is the topic of today's episode, an original Agatha Christie short story, Oh Happy Day, I would like to make you all aware of a promotion that I'm doing on the podcast's Patreon account. From the time I am releasing this episode on October 30th through Guy Fawkes Day, the 5th of November, I am making my latest Patreon episode all about The Hound of the Baskervilles free to download. That means you get not just one, but two spooky stories for this season. And I have to say, I'm so proud of the nearly 3-hour episode I did on this Sherlock Holmes story with mystery author and scholar Nick Cardillo, who is a listener and also a patron himself. We had such a great time. We got into so much about not just Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes, but Christie as well. It was just a pleasure, and I'm really happy to share it with you. Also, I am running a promotion during this same period whereby you will be able to sign up for Patreon at a 20% discount. And that goes for either the monthly or annual subscription model. You can choose what works for you. So I encourage you all to check out the Patreon world of All About Agatha, especially if you haven't up to this point. There is over 6 years worth of content there. So much fun to be had. The link is in the show notes along with the code that you can use to get that 20% discount. And if you end up just listening to the Baskervilles episode and that's it, that's okay too. I hope you enjoy it. I also want to say thank you to all those who have pre-ordered the third book in my Ghostwriter Mysteries series, Sweet Spot, which is now available for pre-order. There is a link to that as well in the show notes. It will be out in June, but pre-orders are live now, and they help me so very much. So thank you for that. Next up, on a more sober note, I want to caution everyone that I will be talking about self-harm at one point in this episode. So just know that that is coming up. And then my final preamble is that I have 2 spoiler warnings for you. I mentioned both Halloween Party and Sleepless Night in this episode in slightly spoilery ways, pretty appropriate spoilers for a Halloween episode. So I wanted you all to be aware of that before I got properly started, which I shall do right now. Let's talk about the Gipsy. This story was published within that oddball collection of largely supernatural stories, The Hound of Death, where the supernatural is not a red herring explained away rationally, but the answer to the solution. Call it a whodunit, if you will. The Hound of Death was first published in 1933, not by William Collins and Sons, but by the appropriately named Odhams Press. Catherine Brobeck and I have discussed this before. I believe I even made that same feeble joke about Odhams Press being appropriately named. Odhams published a magazine called The Passing Show, in which coupons appeared that could be collected and sent in along with 7 shillings for customers to receive one of 6 books. I have also mentioned the books before, but in case you're curious, the other 5 titles were Jungle Girl by Edgar Rice Burroughs, The Sun Will Shine by May Edgington, The Veiled Delight by Marjorie Bowen, The Venner Crime by John Rode, who is the only author on this list I've read other than Edgar Rice Burroughs, and Q33 by George Goodchild. Okay. A regular edition appeared in bookstores in 1936, published by Collins Crime Club, so all was well with the world within a few short years. Also, this story appeared much later in the United States, in 1971, in the collection The Golden Ball and Other Stories. I have to imagine that it was serialized somewhere before it appeared in The Hound of Death in 1933. We have serialization information for half of the titles collected in this book, and I'd really love to be able to pinpoint the initial publication of this story more precisely. Other stories within this collection were serialized as early as 1924. My guess is that this was one of the later stories Christie wrote, maybe not until the early 1930s, more later on in the episode as to why I think so. But for now, it will have to remain a guess because I, for the life of me, could not find any reference to any such serialization. If anyone out there has any information, please email me at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. The Gipsy was also published in the 2019 collection, The Last Seance, Tales of the Supernatural, which includes so many of these stories from The Hound of Death. Interestingly, this was one of the short stories that Christie herself identified as her favorites when she and her publisher were trying to land on a Christie for Christmas short story collection in 1974. Christie sent in a list of short stories among her earlier work that she most liked, even though the list also included later short stories, and The Gipsy was right there on that list, along with 7 other titles from The Hound of Death. Incidentally, it seems that while making this list, Christie spelled Gipsy with 2 Ys, Gypsy, whereas the word is spelled Gipsy in my copy of the book. The spelling seems to depend on the edition. I just wanted to note that because it also brings me to the slightly thorny issue of the title of this short story. This is also something that Catherine Brobeck and I talked about in previous episodes, most notably in Endless Night, which features an estate called Gypsy's Acre. And in fact, Gypsy's Acre is an alternate title for that book. From what I can gather, using the term gypsy to describe the ethnicity of a person more often referred to nowadays as a member of the Roma or Romani peoples, or even as a traveler, is deemed to be more offensive here in the United States than in the United Kingdom. I was interested to see that sometimes people use the umbrella term GRT for Gypsy Roma Traveler to cover all their bases. That is apparently another option. In particular, the phrase, quote, to gyp someone, unquote, which is a shortening of the word gypsy, that refers to cheating or shortchanging a person. That is definitely considered offensive here in the US and I think elsewhere as well. But I feel fairly confident saying that there was little to no sensitivity over the term when Christie used it in this story, or even in Endless Night, which she wrote decades after this one. Endless Night was first published in 1967. So this is not a criticism of Christie. It is merely an acknowledgement that the title and the frequent use of this word in the story may jar a modern-day reader. I just wanted to note that up top. I also wanted to note that, as far as I know, there is no adaptation of this story in existence, which is an unusual situation where a Christie story is concerned. But this is an outlier. This is definitely one of Christie's lesser-known works. There is a reason, after all, that this is one of the last original Christie stories to be covered on this podcast. But if you know of any adaptation in any medium, please do let me know. allaboutthedame@gmail.com. I live for your emails, listeners. Okay, I'm not going to do my usual puzzle mystery breakdown for this story because there is no puzzle mystery here, but I will point out at the outset that it does feature a pretty fantastic last-minute twist. 2 twists, actually. But let's just go through what happens in this story, and we'll get to those twists soon enough. So we open on 2 men. Each has been engaged to one of 2 sisters, the Laws girls, Lawes. Our point of view rests for the duration of the story with McFarlane, a Scot who is engaged to the younger sister, Rachel Laws, whose childlike face and honest brown eyes have grown on him over time. We never get McFarlane's Christian name, so he shall be McFarlane for the duration of the story, and he's described as slow and cautious in all things, sort of stodgy, which definitely corresponds with Christie's depiction of Scots in other books, such as Sleeping Murder, if you know, you know. And again, I just want to be clear that McFarlane is not our narrator, since this story is narrated in the third person, actually. But he is our point of view. The story is definitely told from his perspective. McFarlane's friend is Dickie Carpenter. Dickie is a sailor with a successful career in the Navy who has something of the Viking about him, primitive and direct, a nature on which subtleties of thought were wasted. He belonged to that inarticulate order of young Englishmen who dislike any form of emotion and who find it peculiarly hard to explain their mental processes in words. Man, am I right? Dickie also has a lifelong phobia of gypsies. We'll get there. Also, I just have to acknowledge that whenever I say Dickie, it's impossible for me not to think of Dickie Greenleaf from The Talented Mr. Ripley. I know I am not alone in this. Moving on. So Dickie was engaged not to Marge Sherwood, but to the elder Law's sister, Esther Laws, who is described as a great beauty. And as you probably guessed from those names, Rachel and Esther, the Laws sisters are Jewish. And it's when Esther Laws is described that we get one slightly uncomfortable depiction stuck in its time. Though for early Christie, this is pretty minor. It could be so much worse. I'll just read out the description of Esther now. McFarlane's mind flew swiftly to Esther Laws. He had once heard her summed up as 6'1" of Jewish perfection. A shrewd portrait, he thought, as he remembered her unusual height and the long slenderness of her, the marble whiteness of her face with its delicate, down-drooping nose, and the black splendor of hair and eyes. Yes, he did not wonder that the boyish simplicity of Dickie had capitulated. Esther could never have made his own pulses beat one jot faster, but he admitted her magnificence. Not great. And yet, for the most part, the depiction of these two Jewish sisters, and in particular their relationships with these two seemingly non-Jewish men, is A-okay from the standpoint of stuck in its timeness. So that's good. But did you catch my past tense there when I referred to Dickie and Esther's engagement? Dickie was engaged to Esther. She has called off their engagement, much to Dickie's horror. But when Dickie and McFarlane meet to talk the matter over, it isn't Esther who Dickie wants to talk about. It's the Gipsy. I'm just going to quote again from the text now. This is Dickie speaking to McFarlane. It all started with a dream I had when I was a kid. Not a nightmare exactly. She, the gypsy, you know, would just come into any old dream, even a good dream, or a kid's idea of what's good, a party and crackers and things. I'd be enjoying myself no end, and then I'd know that if I looked up, she'd be there, standing as she always stood, watching me. With sad eyes, you know, as though she understood something that I didn't. Can't explain why it rattled me so, but it did. Every time. I used to wake up howling with terror, and my old nurse used to say, "There, Master Dickie's had one of his gypsy dreams again." And here, listeners, is where I get to indulge one of my favorite activities on this podcast and turn to Agatha Christie's autobiography. Because as many of you will have realized when I read out that quotation from the text, the gypsy is a very thinly veiled reference to a boogeyman from Agatha Christie's own childhood, the gunman. I will quote now from the beginning of Christie's autobiography when she is chronicling her early childhood in what I sometimes find to be suspiciously minute detail. Here goes. My own particular nightmare centered around someone I called the gunman. I never read a story about anyone of the kind. I called him the gunman because he carried a gun, not because I was frightened of his shooting me, or for any reason connected with the gun. The gun was part of his appearance, which seems to me now to have been that of a Frenchman in gray-blue uniform, powdered hair and a queue, and a kind of three-cornered hat, and the gun was some old-fashioned kind of musket. It was his mere presence that was frightening. The dream would be quite ordinary, a tea party or a walk with various people, usually a mild festivity of some kind. Then suddenly a feeling of uneasiness would come. There was someone who ought not to be there. A horrid feeling of fear, and then I would see him, sitting at the tea table, walking along the beach, joining in the game. His pale blue eyes would meet mine, and I would wake up shrieking, "The gunman! The gunman!" Miss Agatha had one of her gunman dreams last night, Nursey would report in her placid voice. "Why is he so frightening, darling?" my mother would ask. "What do you think he will do to you?" I didn't know why he was frightening. Later, the dream varied. The gunman was not always in costume. Sometimes, as we sat round a tea table, I would look across at a friend or a member of the family, and I would suddenly realize that it was not Dorothy or Phyllis or Monty or my mother or whoever it might be. The pale blue eyes in the familiar face met mine under the familiar appearance. It was really the gunman. Incidentally, there is a fantastic visual depiction of the gunman in Agatha Christie, A Life in Pictures, which is a biopic I reviewed somewhat recently on Patreon. It's from 2004. It's actually over 20 years old now, but this is the one where both Olivia Williams and Anna Massey play Agatha Christie, and it has a very spooky gunman in it. Just in case you're looking to scare yourself with some non-fictional Agatha Christie content this Halloween. But this is very interesting, right? Christie has taken something from her own life and just plopped it into the backstory of a fictional character in her spooky tale. And it works. Though for me, it only really works right here in this moment when Dickie is describing this series of childhood nightmares. Because McFarlane then asks, quite reasonably, "Ever been frightened by real gypsies?" And I feel like the answer to this question should be an emphatic no. Just as Christie explained in the autobiography, it had nothing to do with the gun or the fact that he was a soldier or anything like that. I want Dickie to answer in the same fashion here. Because this wasn't a literal thing. This fear is symbolic or figurative. More on that later. But in the story, Dickie tells McFarlane how much later in his life, when he was living in the New Forest and was chasing a pup of his in the woods, he came to a clearing where there was a wooden bridge over a stream, and there was a woman standing beside the bridge, a gypsy, with a red handkerchief over her head, just the same as in my dream. And this woman gives Dickie the same look as the gypsy does in his dreams from childhood. And she says, quite quietly, nodding her head, "I shouldn't go that way if I were you." And even though Dickie is frightened, he goes across the bridge anyway. And it turns out the wood was rotted. I mean, shouldn't he have been able to see that? Anyway. So the bridge gives way, and Dickie falls into the stream and is nearly drowned. And McFarlane is like, sounds to me like this woman was just trying to help you out. Dickie admits you could see it that way, but because of his childish dreams, it was an unpleasant interaction. And whenever he has this sort of foreboding feeling, he calls it the gypsy feeling. Which brings us to the night that he meets the Laws sisters. Actually, the Laws are old friends of his people's, as he puts it, but he hadn't met the Laws girls since he was 7 years old, and the night he reconnects with them, he gets the gypsy feeling again. Esther is actually a late arrival on this evening, so she's not there yet when he encounters the gypsy feeling emanating from another woman at the table. This is a woman named Mrs. Alistair Haworth, who is wearing a red tulle around her neck that has gotten torn so that it's standing up behind her head like little tongues of flame. Also, even though Alistair Haworth is quite fair, when Dickie first sees her, she looks dark to him. A trick of the light, Dickie supposes. Or was it? This reminds me so much of the way that Harley Quinn would manage to have motley squares of light shining on him so that he looks like a classic Harlequin figure whenever he appears in the Mysterious Mr. Quinn short stories. I love it. By the way, when I said Mrs. Alistair Haworth, Alistair is not her husband's name. We learn later that her husband's name is Maurice. Alistair is her name. And I, for one, was surprised by the name Alistair being used for a woman. But apparently this can be a woman's name in Scotland, which is interesting since this is another Scottish touch in the story. First, we've got McFarlane. Now we have this woman named Alistair. And maybe this is a stereotype, but I do feel like Scotland is often associated with the supernatural. And there's no question that the phenomenon of second sight has a particularly rich tradition in Scotland. A second sight is the ability to see into the future, or at least to see that which cannot be seen with the naked eye, which would be first sight. I'm not saying that the only seers or mystics in the world are Scottish, but many associate Scotland with such powers, and I think it's safe to say that Agatha Christie is one of them. And forgive the tangent, but I found myself reflecting on this, how Christie often turns to those regions of the United Kingdom other than England whenever she wants to get a little spooky. The legend of Gypsy's Acre, for instance, in Endless Night, that comes from a real legend that Christie was told by Nora Pritchard, the mother of Christie's son-in-law, Hubert Pritchard. And the Pritchards came from Wales. They're a Welsh family. And I learned from Dr. John Curran in his Secret Notebooks of Agatha Christie that there had been an encampment of Roma peoples in the Vale of Glamorgan in Wales, which was disbanded, and a leader of this group supposedly cursed the land when this happened. And then when numerous road accidents occurred in the vicinity, the tale of this curse gathered support. So that's what Christie heard from Nora Pritchard, and it was one of the inspirations for Endless Night. Christie also attributed a certain fey aspect of her daughter Rosalind's personality to the Irish blood that she inherited through her father, Archie Christie. I do know that Ireland is not part of the United Kingdom, but Northern Ireland is. And there are often such allusions made to the more mystical, whimsical Irish in Christie's work. Anyway, it was just interesting to me that she turned to Scotland in this story, because I think one could make the argument that this is Christie's most Scottish work. We've got more Scottish references to come. But back to the story. Dickie and Alistair take a little postprandial stroll in the garden and have a conversation about what else? Reincarnation. Per Dickie, I remember saying that it seemed to be a jolly sensible way of accounting for how one seems to know some people right off, as if you'd met them before. And then Alistair responds, "You mean lovers?" And here's Dickie's impression of that. There was something queer about the way she said it, something soft and eager. It reminded me of something, but I couldn't remember what. Interesting. And then Esther Laws arrives, and Dickie is all excited to go in, but Mrs. Haworth puts her hand on his arm and says, "I shouldn't go in if I were you." Ye old gypsy feeling, rearing its ugly head for the second time that evening. Dickie is frightened, so he rather rudely just runs off, and the moment he sees Esther, he realizes he's head over heels in love with this beautiful girl. So Esther and Dickie get engaged about a week later, and then about 2 weeks after that, Esther breaks it off. As Dickie puts it, it took her about a fortnight to find out that she didn't care after all. Poor Dickie. This happens to him on the last evening before he is due back on his ship, because let's remember, he is in the Navy. And he recounts another little story to Macfarlane from that night that Esther broke off their engagement. On that night, he was coming back through the village when he saw her. Not Esther, but Mrs. Haworth. And this time she has on a red tam o' shanter, which for the uninitiated is that sort of beret-ish bonnet you see men wearing sometimes. It doesn't have a visor, and it often has a little bobbly thing on the top of it in the middle. More often than not, I think you'll see people depicted in this headgear while playing golf. And can you guess which country is associated with the tam o' shanter, just as it is also associated with golf? That's right, Scotland. Anyway, Dickie is getting gypsy vibes again, and yet he walks with Mrs. Haworth for a bit, and at this point in the story, he says something very interesting. "Then we walked along a bit," he says to Macfarlane. "Not that there was a word Esther couldn't have heard, you know." And this is Macfarlane's response to that. "No?" Macfarlane looked at his friend curiously. "Strange how people told you things of which they themselves were unconscious." Because isn't it strange how, in supposedly unburdening his heart to his friend about the woman who just jilted him, Dickie can't stop talking about the gypsy woman. He's barely mentioned Esther, right? Let's just keep that in mind. So once again, Mrs. Haworth warns him off. It happens when he turns to go back home. She says, "I shouldn't go back too soon if I were you." And when he goes home, Esther breaks off the engagement. I mean, maybe she saw him gallivanting about the village with Mrs. Haworth, just as he'd been doing in the garden when Esther first reconnected with Dickie. Can we entirely blame Esther Laws here? But Dickie is heartbroken, and he says that he didn't see Mrs. Haworth again until this very night on which he is telling McFarlane his story. And this is what he says. Yes, at the Dr. Johnny's nursing home. They had a look at my leg, the one that got messed up in that torpedo business. It's worried me a bit lately. The old chap advised an operation. It'll be quite a simple thing. Then as I left the place, I ran into a girl in a red jumper over her nurse's things, and she said, I wouldn't have that operation if I were you. Then I saw it was Mrs. Haworth. She passed on so quickly I couldn't stop her. I met another nurse and asked about her, but she said there wasn't anyone of that name in the home. Queer. Sure it was her? Oh, yes, you see, she's very beautiful. He paused and then added, I shall have the old op, of course, but in case my number should be up. Rot. Of course it's not, but all the same, I'm glad I told you about this Gipsy business. You know, there's more of it. If only I could remember. Very, very interesting. By the way, I love that the allusion to a gypsy's red headscarf is getting weaker and weaker as the story goes on. This iteration of Mrs. Haworth is merely wearing a red jumper, and Dickie is like, close enough. So at this point, we end the first section of the story, and we move on to section 2, in which McFarlane is visiting none other than Mrs. Haworth herself at her village house, which is just off a large and sprawling moorland. Because of course it is. This is exactly the sort of spookily romantic story that should feature a moor, in the very best Wuthering Heights tradition. Catherine Brobeck would have been so pleased to hear me referencing Wuthering Heights now. Though Jane Eyre is still better, and features plenty of moorland as well. I'll stop now. Alistair Haworth is singing a song when McFarlane arrives, and here are the lyrics we get. The gypsy woman lives on the moor. Subtle, Agatha. Very subtle. When McFarlane sees Alistair Haworth in the flesh for the first time, because up till now he's only heard about her, he is taken aback by just how beautiful she is. Quoting again from the text, the bewildering, almost Scandinavian fairness of her came as a shock. In spite of Dickie's description, he had imagined her gypsy dark, and he suddenly remembered Dickie's words and the peculiar tone of them. You see, she's very beautiful. Perfect, unquestionable beauty is rare, and perfect, unquestionable beauty was what Alistair Haworth possessed. McFarlane says he got her address from the Laws family. Remember, he is engaged to Rachel Laws. And Mrs. Haworth invites him to walk with her up on the moor. He agrees, getting a glimpse of Mr. Maurice Haworth first. This is Alistair's husband, and he is described as a heavy, rather foolish-looking man, sitting in a basket chair, smoking. McFarlane has no idea why such a woman would end up with such a man, but he has other matters to discuss because, unfortunately, tragically, Dickie's operation did not go so well. Dickie is dead. The leg operation was successful, but his heart must have been weak, and he died while he was still under anesthesia. And when McFarlane tells this to Alistair, this is what he sees on her face. What he expected to see on her face, he scarcely knew, hardly that look of utter, eternal weariness. He heard her murmur, again, to wait, so long, so long. Curiouser and curiouser, no? McFarlane asks Alistair if she was the nurse who warned Dickie against the operation, and she says no, but she does have a cousin who looks like her in dim lighting, and this cousin must have been the one to warn poor Dickie. She says it doesn't really matter, and off McFarlane's confusion, she realizes that he doesn't understand. Second sight runs in her family, you see, and Alistair can see into both the future and the past. I'm a Ferguson, she explains. There's second sight in the family, and my mother was a medium until my father married her. Christing was her name. She was rather celebrated. Alistair can tell that McFarlane also has the gift. I mean, he's Scottish, right? She tells him to look at this hollow in the rocks on the moor, and when he does, McFarlane sees blood there for a moment, which she says is from old sun worshippers who sacrificed their victims out in such places. And I would add, overzealous Adonis-like landscape architects who would do anything to see their dreams realized. I couldn't forgive myself for passing up that Halloween party reference on this episode of all episodes. It seems that this ability even allows Alistair to divine the thoughts of others, because she knows that McFarlane was wondering why she married her husband. And she explains that it's because I've always known that there's something dreadful hanging over him. I wanted to save him from it. Women are like that. With my gift, I ought to be able to prevent it happening. She wasn't able to prevent something bad happening to Dickie, however, who we learn was only 22, whereas she is 30. Still quoting from Alistair, who gets very chatty at the end of this story. There are so many ways of being divided, length and height and breadth, but to be divided by time is the worst way of all. Okay. McFarlane's visit soon ends, and when he asks to see Alistair again, she says she fancied that we shouldn't meet again. Ruh-roh. This is where McFarlane needs to be very careful, and fortunately for him, he actually is careful. So good on McFarlane. He takes the road back to the village very slowly, and wouldn't you know, a car nearly flattens him, but he avoids it just in time. Phew. Cut to our third section of the story, in which McFarlane wakes up the next morning, reviewing the dreary journey home the day before, during which the car incident was the first in a series of near escapes. Quoting now from the text, the motor, the shortcut to the inn, and the sudden mist that had made him lose his way, with the knowledge that a dangerous bog was no distance off. Pausing just to note that this is so The Hound of the Baskervilles coded. Having just covered that novel on the podcast Patreon account, I was tickled by that. Back to the text. Then the chimney pot that had fallen off the inn, and the smell of burning in the night which he had traced to a cinder on his hearthrug. Nothing in it at all. And McFarlane is seized with an energy to prove Alistair Haworth wrong in her premonition that they wouldn't meet again. So he goes back up to the Haworth residence on the edge of the moor, triumphantly announcing himself. But wouldn't you know, Alistair Haworth died the night before. It seems that she took a tonic every night, and her husband handed her the wrong bottle in the middle of the night, resulting in her death. He is beside himself, and McFarlane is reminded of Alistair's premonition that something dreadful was hanging over this man, who she did her best to save. The servant at the house asks if he'd like to see Alistair, since she mentioned to this servant that McFarlane must have known her long ago, a very long time ago. And so McFarlane visits the body, and here we get our most direct reference to the mysterious Mr. Quinn, because this time there is a stained glass window. And just as happens in the Quinn stories, the light coming through that glass is colored. This time it is red, and it throws a red light over Alistair's head that looks just like a red handkerchief. Even in the repose of death, she is still Dickie Carpenter's long-feared Gipsy. In the fourth and final, and extremely short, section of this story, McFarlane is roused from a brown study by his landlady, who says that there is another lady to see him. McFarlane tells the landlady he's been seeing ghosts, and the landlady references a number of ghostly figures who are rumored to be seen out on the moor from time to time. There's the White Lady, and the Devil's Blacksmith, and the Sailor and the Gypsy. McFarlane stops her there. What's that? A sailor and a gypsy? So they say, sir. It was quite a tale in my young days. Crossed in love they were, a while back, but they've not walked for many a long day now. No? I wonder if perhaps they will again now. But at this point, the landlady is like, your visitor who's waiting? And you know who that visitor is? It's Rachel Laws, his affianced, who is very much alive, very much a denizen of the real and regular world of 3 dimensions, as opposed to these ghostly planes McFarlane has been contemplating. And so he goes to her, Rachel, with her honest brown eyes. And I'll just read out from there till the end of the story. And suddenly, like a man awakening from a dream, a warm rush of glad reality swept over him. He was alive, alive! He thought, There's only one life one can be sure about. This one. Rachel, he said, and lifting her chin, he kissed her lips. The end.
Don't touch that dial. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of our episode. We just wanted to take a moment to ask you, our dear listeners, for a favor.
If you haven't already done so, we would very much appreciate it if you take a moment to, give us a rating or a review wherever you're listening to this podcast.
It really helps the podcast out because ratings and reviews make it much easier for other Christie fans such as yourselves to find our podcast.
And the more ratings and reviews we get, the more people we can reach.
It should take you a matter of seconds, and lucky you, we're going to provide you with those seconds right now, so go to it.
Thank you so much. And now, back to our regularly scheduled programming.
Well. There is quite a lot going on in this story, isn't there? There are many things I love about the Gipsy. One of them is that we get 2 or perhaps even 3 supernatural/spiritual musings for the price of 1. Christie manages to stuff in multiple references not only to the notion of second sight, but also to ghosts inhabiting a different plane who are visible to us only at night, and finally to reincarnation. Because that early reference to reincarnation early in the story wasn't merely incidental, of course. Christie doesn't waste a word. It's pretty clear that Dickie and Alistair are the sailor and gypsy on the moor who were crossed in love in a previous life and who have been doomed to miss each other in future lives, including the ones they just led. Even McFarlane himself can be supposed to have been associated with these souls in past lives. I think that's what's behind Alistair's comment about having known McFarlane from a very long time ago. I did find it amusing that the reason given for why Dickie and Alistair couldn't have joined together in this life was due to their, gasp, 8-year age gap. Let's remember, Dickie is 22 and Alistair is 30. An 8-year age gap where the woman is older than the man. Oh, horrors. I mean, it's not nothing, especially 100-ish years ago. And there's something sweet, if a little spiritually jumbled, about imagining these two as frustrated ghosts who have lived out multiple lives trying to get back together. It's like a mashing together of Eastern and Western beliefs. I like it. But now let's talk about those end-of-story twists. The more obvious twist is that Alistair, the seer, the possessor of this second sight that she has tried to wield for good, ends up only doing harm. She fails to save Dickie. All she does is traumatize him at several points in his young life. And in an even crueler irony, she is the very cause of the grief that she could see hanging over the man she married in an attempt to prevent that very grief. I find this poignant, and there is a much more accessible, even universal message you could argue Christie is conveying here in terms of those who try to play God, those who take on too much and end up doing more harm than good as a result. Alistair would have been better served by a little, dare I say, Christian humility where her second sight powers are concerned, right? And before I get to the second twist, I'd like to dwell on this first twist for a little longer, because I think there is also something really interesting in the fact that Christie has turned the Gipsy, who is a stand-in for the gunman from her old childhood dream, into a victim herself. And the reason I think that's interesting is that there's a little more insight to be gleaned as to Christie's thoughts on the gunman. Not from her autobiography, but from a text that many, including Christie's second husband, Max Mallowan, argue is just as much of an autobiographical text, possibly even the ultimate autobiographical text. I am speaking of the Mary Westmacott novel, Unfinished Portrait, first published just 1 year after The Hound of Death in 1934. Catherine Brobeck and I covered this novel on the podcast's Patreon account, and when we did, it was extremely revealing to compare it to Christie's autobiography, because in many respects, the two texts map out the exact same life events. But in the case of the Westmacott novel, the names are all changed, and there's a great deal of emotional context and color provided, which the breezy autobiography lacks. The fictional Celia in this novel is an obvious substitute for Agatha, and just as in the autobiography, Celia has a recurring nightmare involving the gunman. But in Unfinished Portrait, we learn that later in life, when Celia's marriage to her ex-soldier husband is falling apart, sound familiar? The gunman comes back. This happens during a period of time when Celia has turned suicidal. And this, too, is much more forthright than anything we get in the autobiography. Celia is basically cracking up. She's imagining different ways to end her life, and then she's imagining her mother, who has died recently, telling her how silly she's being. And now I'll quote from the text late in Unfinished Portrait. And I'll just note that Dermot is the name of her husband, so he is our stand-in for Archie Christie here. Here goes. Silly, yes, silly. Dermot had thought her silly long ago. He had said so, and his face had reminded her of something. Of course, of the gunman. That was the horror of the gunman. All the time, Dermot had really been the gunman. She felt sick with fear. She must get home. She must hide. The gunman was looking for her. Dermot was stalking her down. So this very sad sequence of events continues in Unfinished Portrait and ends in an actual suicide attempt on Celia's part. Personally, I believe there is great emotional truth to all of this, that here is where we get Christie's best description and explanation of her state of mind during her disastrous 11-day disappearance, the centenary of which is coming up, by the way. That happened back in December of 1926. So how interesting is it, then, that Christie chooses to neutralize this character, turning the gunman into the Gipsy, a well-meaning soul who was just trying to help people and ended up hurting those she loved the most. But now here is where I will introduce what I see as the second and more devious twist in the story. Do we really believe that Alistair Haworth had nothing to do with her own demise? She, whose powers of second sight were so prodigious? I think it's much more likely that Alistair knew exactly what was happening when her husband handed her that bottle. This was on the very night that she had learned from McFarlane that Dickie was dead, that he had moved on to another plane of existence, and I think that Alistair was eager to follow him, to go after him and attempt to be reunited with him. And so either she took that wrong bottle in the moment, took advantage of an opportunity that presented itself, or perhaps she even replaced that tonic bottle with something poisonous, knowing that her doofus of a husband would hand her the wrong bottle. Perhaps she worried that if she did the ultimate deed herself, that if she was too forthright about what would amount to an act of suicide, she wouldn't be able to join her darling Dickie in the afterlife. I still believe that she married Maurice Haworth with the best of intentions, but when it was crunch time, when she needed to make a move to be with the one she truly loved, her soulmate, if you will, down the ages, she gave into her selfish nature, and she did not hesitate to sacrifice this poor man, Maurice Haworth. This, too, is very much like the Dermot character in Unfinished Portrait. At the end of that novel, we get what I find to be a devastating summation of the character of Archie Christie by way of the fictional Dermot. Here goes. If he had let himself believe he was being cruel to Celia, he couldn't have done it. He was, like many brutally honest men, dishonest about himself. He thought himself a finer fellow than he really was. Oof, that hurts. And maybe the same can be said for Alistair Haworth, because in the end, I believe this story is about betrayal. And not just the betrayal of silly old Maurice Haworth, but the beautiful Gypsy's betrayal of her own better nature, of all those good intentions that she had for the people in her life. And so it's no wonder that our final image in this story has nothing to do with these two ghostly lovers reunited on the moorland in the dark. Forget them, right? It makes so much sense to me that Christie allows McFarlane, her second-sighted Scott, to reject all that and to return to the mundane world of the here and now and to give his earthly and earthy beloved a kiss. And this, listeners, is why I would really love to know precisely when Christie wrote this story, whether it was indeed in the early 1930s, as I suspect, specifically sometime after September 1930, because that is when Agatha Christie married her second husband, Max Mallowan. And I have a feeling that when she kissed her new husband for the first time, she felt a little bit like McFarlane at the end of this story, embracing his beloved and embracing the world of the here and now. Though who knows, maybe Christie wrote it years earlier. And if so, I can easily adjust my interpretation to conform to those new facts, like any good literary scholar out there. Because if Christie did write this story before meeting Max Mallowan, perhaps she inherited a certain power from her mother, whose own psychic intuition she mentions several times in her autobiography. Perhaps Agatha Christie herself possessed a little bit of that eerie, uncanny power of second sight. Well, happy Halloween. I hope you enjoyed my spooky analysis of The Gipsy by Agatha Christie / Mary Westmacott. I mean, not really, but it is a rather Mary Westmacott-ish story, isn't it? I had a lot of fun with this one, but I am looking forward to my next episode, which should also be a lot of fun because Veterans Day is almost upon us, listeners. And you know what that means? I am going to be covering the veterans of Agatha Christie. It's time for another themed episode. I cannot wait. So that will be next time on All About Agatha. In the meantime, I encourage you all to capitalize on that Patreon promotion that I'm offering. Go ahead and click on that link in the show notes. You can check out The Hound of the Baskervilles for free. You can use the code provided in the show notes for a discounted membership to Patreon on a monthly or a yearly basis, whichever you desire. My next Patreon episode, out in just a few days, is going to be essentially the director's cut of the presentation that I did at the Agatha Christie Festival this year. I mentioned in that presentation that I had to cut a bunch of true crime references Christie makes in her stories since I only had an hour to do that presentation. So I'm going to be going over everything that I left out for November's Patreon. So much fun to be had over there. Also, as I mentioned up top, I encourage you all to pre-order the third book in my Ghostwriter Mysteries series. It is called Sweet Spot, and it is available for pre-order. There is a link in the show notes, and I've also got a link there to the podcast's Instagram account at All About Agatha and my author website, KemperDonovan.com. Email me at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. I love hearing from you all. And please don't hesitate to leave a rating and or a review. I'm always on the lookout for more of those. And I'll see you next time. Happy Halloween, everyone. Bye.
What is the Sesame Street number of the day?